And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our fellow board member and spokesperson for Freethought Arizona, Gil Shapiro.
Thank you, Diane. Welcome. What a nice turnout. Glad to see everyone here. Just quickly, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Gil Shapiro. I've been with Freethought Arizona for about 10 years. I'm on the board, it's spokesman, and retired podiatrist after 36 years of fixing feet. I no longer start my talks off with who would rather hear me speak about bunions. Done. So, this is just going to be a brief introduction, then Dan is going to do his presentation. So, I thought it would be appropriate, even though this has been written about online and in the paper on Thursday, about how this all evolved. Dan, that's just an expression. Dan Grossenbach is an instructor in Christian apologetics at the Catalina Foothills Church. And just to clarify, the word apologetics does not mean apologizing for anything. It's from the Greek apologia, which is the word that means in defense of, defending the faith. It is an evangelical fundamentalist church in Tucson. And he wanted me to explain to his class both secular humanism and my thoughts about Christianity. He asked me to be straightforward, and I was, and to not pull any punches, and I did not. That said, it was a frank and very respectful talk. The presentation was titled, What a Secular Humanist Wants Christians to Know, and it was given on August 14th at his church. It was a packed room like this. He responded to that presentation the following week, and to say the least, it was a fascinating and spirited exchange. Yeah, there are going to be a few of those. The goals for Dan and me and the groups we represent are to explain and gain a better understanding of the other side's worldview, to better understand our own worldview and the other side's thought processes, to reconcile that only by first defining the issues we all face in our society can their solutions be found, and to learn what we can compromise on, what we can negotiate on, and just what issues are, we're just irreconcilable. We cannot move off the dime. But those are the three options: compromise, negotiate, or they're irreconcilable. Dan was invited to give a counter-presentation today, and the title would have been, What a Christian Wants Secular Humanists to Know. However, he decided that a debate would be more interesting. And he chose the topic, Does Christianity Best Explain Reality? And I said I'd be happy to debate that. So, first of all, a little housekeeping. We're each going to go up to about 25 minutes. Then Dan, since he's taking the affirmative position, will go first. Then I will follow. There'll be a couple of minutes where we need to switch laptops. Then there'll be a 10-minute rebuttal of what I said and he said, obviously. Dan will go first in that rebuttal, then I will follow. And then we will open it up to questions and answers. Now, these are the kind of presentations that in the Q&A, sometimes people, instead of asking a question, would like to do a counter-presentation. If you want to do a counter-presentation, send a note to Jerry Karchus, and we'll consider it. But as many times as you've been in these things, even though you say, please, what is your question? It goes on and on. So if you're interested in a question posed to Dan or me, fill out the sheet of paper that you have. You're going to give it to Jerry or Steve, and they will go through it and be as fair as they can about the nature of the questions and who gets to answer them and all that. Also, part of the rebuttal may be, and I didn't discuss this with Dan, but if it's okay, sometimes we might be inclined to ask each other questions during that time. Okay. So, the next part, and bear with me for a few minutes, is since this is a Freethought Arizona meeting, I need to speak to the Freethought people here primarily, but this involves everybody, because for those who are not Freethought Arizona members, it gives you a sense of what our concerns are, especially after the election. The election has placed the secular community on notice. The Christian influence in the executive branch, in the Republican-dominated Congress, and in the Supreme Court will inevitably further polarize conservative Christians and secularists. Our government will primarily use faith-based thinking rather than reason-based thinking, and we're getting into the, kind of the opinion part, so bear with it. This is our view. We'll use reason-based thinking for the laws and policies they want to enact. Now, what I'm going to read here is a brief little letter that we received from a constitutional attorney named Eddie Tabash, who's a lawyer in Los Angeles. He is the chair of the Center for Inquiry, which is the think tank for secularism just outside of Buffalo, New York. Quote, "We are concerned that Christianity will be used as an excuse, if not a weapon, to limit and deny many Americans their constitutional rights. President Trump will replace the late Associate Justice Scalia with a conservative. Then he will probably have the opportunity to nominate at least 2 more Supreme Court justices. Many observers expect he will replace Justice Anthony Kennedy, now age 80, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now 83. In each case, by appointing very conservative justices, President Trump will radically alter the direction of the court for decades to come. Why? Well, Justice Anthony Kennedy, a perennial swing vote on the Roberts Court, often took laudable positions in church-state decisions, and in fact authored the trilogy of decisions that moved lesbians and gays from facing imprisonment for expressing their love to being able to marry in every state of the nation. For her part, Ginsburg has been one of the court's leading civil libertarian voices. A U.S. Supreme Court remolded by President Trump would likely hand down adverse rulings that might include, they might declare that the First Amendment's religion clauses, now the First Amendment of our Constitution has about 5 parts to it, but the first part is the religion part, and in it, it has 2 clauses. Congress shall make no law establishing, which is the establishment clause of that, the establishment of religion, semicolon, or the free exercise thereof. And that's the exercise part. So what Eddie Tabash is concerned about is that declaring that the First Amendment's religion clauses forbid only discrimination among religions and denominations, but allows such discrimination between the religious and non-religious, establishing explicitly that atheists, secular humanists, and other non-religious Americans are second-class citizens. This could possibly happen. The late Justice Scalia once held that the principle that government cannot favor religion over irreligion is demonstrably false. That's what Scalia's position was. Imagine a Supreme Court packed with justices who share this intolerant, and according to Eddie Tabash, wrong, view of what the Constitution provides. He's also concerned with overturning Roe v. Wade, or the overturning of Roe v. Wade, ending or at least further obstructing women's access to safe legal abortion. And it says, don't be surprised if there's a follow-on effort to restrict contraception. He's concerned about legitimizing voucher schemes and other efforts to steer billions in taxpayer funds towards religious schools, expanding the distribution of public funds to religious charities that can use those funds to discriminate in hiring or indirectly fund explicitly religious services. He's concerned about overturning the Johnson Amendment, which bars tax-exempt institutions, including churches, from endorsing political candidates. Approval of a wide range of religious exemptions from health care and other laws. Curtailing the fundamental rights to freedom of speech and the press as Americans have known them for generations. Turning back hard-won victories in marriage equality, LGBT rights, and even pay equity between men and women. Appalling as this may sound, this is only the beginning of the devastation a Trump presidency might herald. Under Trump, America will likely withdraw from the campaign against climate change that it was only just beginning to lead. While that might guarantee our grandchildren a marginally safe, livable world, it may trap their grandchildren in a hellish ecosystem swirling towards irrevocable collapse. There is no reason to suspect that a Trump administration would be at all friendly towards the public understanding of science, let alone evolutionary theory, a particular target of Vice President-elect Mike hence. So that's what the position of the Center for Inquiry think tank is. This is me now. That said, we all live together in a pluralistic society, where the first step in getting along is to understand our respective positions and to see how much room there is for compromise, for negotiation. We also need to know what issues our differences are irreconcilable. And kind of like, that excuse when a marriage falls apart because of irreconcilable differences, well, we can have them too. But we're not in a marriage here. We're kind of stuck with each other, and we have to make it work. So these kinds of discussions are very important for both sides. They say sometimes in arguments there's what he said and what she said, and then there's the truth. So I am aware that I'm going to present a very strong position for my side, as Dan will for his side, and you'll decide whether one side is totally right, the other side is totally right, or somewhere, in between. So again, here are the areas of disagreement that once we have our positions laid out, that we need to talk about. Some of them are going to be a little repeating what I had said before, but I have them down here. Is we're going to need to talk secular humanists and Christians. We'll need to talk to each other about separation of religion and government, homosexuality and gay rights, abortion control and birth control, end-of-life issues, physician-assisted end-of-life measures. Sometimes it was called suicide. That's been a pejorative term. We'll just say helping to care for patients by ending their life. Sometimes called euthanasia, but that's usually, with animals, but we can reframe or rephrase it. We need to also talk about education, the pros and cons of homeschooling, the creationism evolution debate in schools, sex education, and prayer in schools. We need to talk about tax benefits for houses of worship and the clergy, and employment restricted only to people who share a certain faith, and of course, religious freedom and liberty. So Dan and I, with your help, will lead our two groups to see if negotiation and compromise are possible for resolving the social, economic, and political issues that affect us. And even the bigger question, what do we do when we just bump up against irreconcilable differences? We all have to live together. How do we deal with those? Well, from my point of view, I'll quote Ronald Reagan, where he said, "I am cautiously optimistic," and I hope Dan is too. And with that, it is my pleasure to meet my new best friend, Dan Grossenbach.
Bear with me a moment while I plug in here. Okay, that'll work. All right, well, I'm starting my time, Gil. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. I want to pay special thanks to the board members, Jerry, Steve, Diane, and of course, Gil, for having me here on this Sunday where you're hearing from a Christian teacher who went to seminary. So I think we just need one song and you got church. All right. Sorry about that. I have to admit, I do feel a little bit like Daniel in the Lion's Den, although my name is Daniel, so hopefully it's only half right. I wanted to start by just saying that I came here to defend today that Christianity does have the best explanation for reality. And if you can't hear me, raise your hand or let me know. It's important you all hear this. There's a lot of information. And the debate today is specifically on this question, and I have two very simple contentions. First of all, Christianity, yes, does best explain reality, and that it has the best explanatory scope and power and plausibility of any other rival explanation. And the second one is like it, that no other rival explanation will meet the standard and be sufficient to explain reality. And what do I mean by reality? Well, there's four key aspects of reality that I say all religions or all humans in the human condition have to wrestle with, the foundations of our world and where we live. What Christianity am I here to defend? That could be a very slippery term, so it would be unfair to say it's Dan's Christianity or it's all Christianity, because there's a lot of different interpretations and denominations. So what I want to do is get to the core of Christianity, what runs the common belief threads that we see in the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and that just take the general reliability of Scripture. I'm going to use abductive reasoning in this approach. That's a fancy word for detective work. And I know that because I am a detective. I'm a criminal investigator by profession. But it's not only that. It's how scientists examine ancient events. It's how Darwin came up with his theory through abductive reasoning, also known as inference to the best explanation. Given what we do know, facts about the world, what can we infer from that? So it's a probability-based argument. And it's cumulative. I have 4 different facts I'm going to review with you, and they build on each other, and they're foundational to how we end up coming up with different policy matters in society, how we deal with each other. And I think you'll see how it all works as we go through it. The first one is very basic, that anything exists at all. The universe exists. It comes to a very classical argument known as the Kalam cosmological argument, that basically everything, well, first of all, the universe began to exist. That's a fact that we all know. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. In uniform and repeated human experience, everything that begins to exist has a cause. By logical necessity, the conclusion follows that the universe had a cause. And what can we know about that cause? Well, we know it has to be supernatural. This isn't spooky stuff. It has to come from outside of nature. No more than the Lorax can lift himself up by the seat of his pants and pass through the clouds, can the universe, the natural world, create the universe, the natural world. It must be uncaused, or you encounter an infinite regress that is illogical. It must be spaceless, because space itself and time was created, so it's timeless. It must be immaterial, because it created the material world. It must be personal, volitional, or willful, because it had to decide to create rather than not create. It must be ultimately powerful, because the energy that we know happened in the Big Bang. And rational, going along with the laws of nature, and it's not a universe of chaos, but there's order to the laws of logic, physics, chemistry, and hard sciences. It must be independent, meaning that it's not depending on any other external force. It acted all on its own. I argue Christianity and theism generally does a best case of offering an explanation, because far before we knew the science, or even before the Kalam cosmological argument, thousands of years before, we already had embedded in the belief system that the agent of the universe, God, is uncaused, spaceless, immaterial, timeless, personal, powerful, rational, independent, and of course supernatural. So without offering any sort of rebuttal to an alternative view, and Dr. Shapiro can pick any alternative view, all the defense and burden is on me. I'll wait to hear what he offers as an explanation or critique before answering any other alternative. Number 2, the arrival of biological information. We know about 3.8 billion years ago, life was created on the earth. And before any mechanism took place to develop life as we know it, there was something embedded in the cell prior to that first life form ever being that first life form. And that is very complex information encoded in the DNA. The DNA has strands here, and there's the A's, T's, C's, and G's for the nucleotide bases that make up this, and all along the strand, they have to be in a very particular order to carry out a function, which is the body plan for the cell factory that's generating that organism. So the logic behind this, the logical syllogism I have, is that all life requires DNA or RNA to begin. Prior to it, DNA, RNA is information, and I'll explain what information is in a minute. And number 3, information requires a mind, and again, uniform, repeated human experience, all information requires a mind. And so the conclusion that follows necessarily is that life required a mind. Now, what is DNA, RNA, real quick? I'm not a biologist, I don't have a biology degree, but I am a trained investigator. So I looked into this, and I think it's pretty accurate, is that the DNA, RNA is a blueprint for a body plan. So if you are an oak tree, the seed of an oak tree has the DNA to create an oak tree and leaves rather than a chimpanzee's ear, for instance. So each species will have its own blueprint for that body plan. It's also a cell factory, and there's molecular machines at work. And the study in this uses engineering terms to describe what's happening here. So you have the DNA The brain and the information is here, carried by the RNA to the ribosomes that actually shape and synthesize the protein into the proper fold to make an ear or a nose or skin tissue or whatever the cell may be. So it's important to differentiate complexity versus information, because I've heard PhDs in the field who will talk about something that's incredibly complex. But that's not what we're talking about here. Nature can make a snowflake that's very unique, or crystalline structures that are beautiful to look at under the microscope, or things in nature that we can see when we just go to the beach or to the mountains. But that's not information. Information has to be a certain way for it to perform a particular function. There's a difference. A movie I really liked when I was in college, and the book I read in high school, Contact by Carl Sagan, speaks to it really, really well, because the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, was a project to identify intelligent life outside of our solar system and possibly our galaxy. And there was a way that they were able to find the difference. At first, they would get they used radio telescopes, and they would get cosmic noise. And the pattern they would get, or whether it's audible or digital or video here, you would see a very specific pattern, and it's incredibly complex. There's no other screen like this. The arrangement of the white and black dots is very complex and particular. But what it didn't do is perform any function. It could be mirrored image, and it would still be equally complex. What they started to see was every other prime number, which said something's out there. But then when they started seeing a signal through the TV, something started to make out and become focused. And that was the 1936 opening ceremony of Hitler's speech inaugurating the games. And that was the first internationally televised event that was broadcast so far and wide that they figured the star system was now returning the signal that they had just received. This is similar to the first organism that came on Earth. This is a picture of an E. coli bacteria, a computer rendering of one. And this is a single-cell organism that is very, very basic in its structure. Now, as basic as it is, before it could have the flagellum, the motor, all of the material mechanisms that it had to have information. And the amount of information the most simple bacteria had was 4.6 megabytes of information. That is the New Testament, the Old Testament combined, plus Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, the United States Constitution, and my 2003 Toyota 4Runner Operator's Manual. And the symbolism or the comparison to language is not an analogy. It's a one-for-one comparison, one that Richard Dawkins himself uses to explain how complex and perfect it has to go. The only difference is with language, you can miss a letter here and there. But if you have a mutation of one of those nucleotide bases, it can completely, most of the time, it completely wrecks the organism and it will kill it. I'll wait for Dr. Shapiro to have another example of where information can come from, because remember, in uniform and repeated human experience, information always comes from a mind. That's how we operate on a daily basis. When we see a pattern that carries a function, like a computer program, we don't assume that that's because the universe is 13.8 billion years, and the time it takes to just have a computer create itself is what we expect. We expect a mind behind it. Evil. Dr. Shapiro, when he came to visit us, brought up several cases, very sad cases, of 25,000 children dying a year. And I think this is where the conversation really needs to go. There is a logic that I'll present on this, but this is the topic that really hits at the core of our human condition and where we can resonate with it at the heart level. When Gil was 7, there was a boy who was from Chicago visiting family in rural Mississippi. His name's Emmett Till. And he was at a store, and there was a white shopkeeper there in 1955 who he paid a nice compliment to. The woman's husband didn't like that and got his brother, went and found Emmett Till, dragged him out of the house, and beat him to a pulp in an inch of his life before they shot and killed him and dumped his body into a nearby river. The men that did this, everybody knew who it was, and they were arrested, and they were acquitted because the body was so badly beaten they could not identify him as the victim. When the mother Mrs. Till got Emmett's body in a box in Chicago, she said, "We will have an open casket funeral." When I was 6, I was going to move to Florida, and my mother was terrified. Just months before, Adam Walsh was abducted in a similar manner as Emmett Till, and there's a long search for him, and he was on the milk cartons, and they launched a big campaign until his severed head was found by the side of the Florida Turnpike, and the man that killed him never faced justice in this world. He died in 1997. Closer to home, I'll skip that one. Evil exists. We know it exists. And this is something that I'm pulling at your heartstrings, I know, but this is my logic behind it. If evil exists, that means there's a way things aren't supposed to be. And if there's a way things are not supposed to be, and we all know it, that entails an objective good. Where does this objective good come from? Is it just what I want, what I feel, what we feel as a community? Or is there something that transcends people, that we can say that the Nazis were really wrong, that the Civil War South, antebellum South was really wrong, and that we can make progress? Did it precede humanity, or did the first two people get to pick whatever they wanted and invent morality? When they first met each other, was it love or hate? Take your pick. If I beat you up and take your stuff, I win, and that's the morality? Or did it precede humanity? How about holding accountable? The murder of Adam Walsh and Emmett Till never paid for that. If there's no justice, there's no injustice. And humanity, what makes humans valuable? I mean, the bacteria is much more numerous, preceded us, in some ways is more resilient. Why kill it and not us? What source of objective goodness best fits the facts that we do know? Well, again, prior to these kinds of arguments and debates, the Bible had clearly said that God does transcend humanity, that God preceded humanity. And my slides will be available. There's a lot of quotes here I'm throwing up there, a lot of citations from Scripture that'll be available on our church website, or you can email me afterwards. God holds humanity accountable. Nobody gets away. Joseph Stalin doesn't get away, a rich man dying of an old age, just like anybody else on our little petty crimes either. And God does value humanity. We are built into His image. And God is objective goodness. That's what we mean by saying God. If He was not, we wouldn't call Him God and we wouldn't worship Him. What other option do we have to make sense of evil in the world? We may not always know why it happens, but that it exists at all, to lodge the complaint against God or anybody else, where are we saying evil comes from? I'll leave it for Dr. Shapiro to give an answer, and then I'll say my rebuttal for that. Jesus being the last, fourth and final. We know 3 facts that are not disputed among scholars today. There will be those on the fringe, like there are several Holocaust deniers. There are some that are on the outside of their fold, outside of their craft, who will deny these. But for the large part, anybody has a professorship at a significant university will concede these three points. First of all, that Jesus was killed by a Roman crucifixion team in Palestine in the 1st century. That people had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus after his death, and that hostile parties, namely Paul and James, accepted the fact that he was raised from the dead, despite being a skeptic. Now, real quickly, how they do this. I am standing on the shoulders of giants who just concede these, but it is worth pointing out some reasons for it. Basically, Jesus scholars use what's called a criteria of authenticity. Historians use these, and it helps get inference to the best explanation. So in history, we can know what probably happened. And in any historical event, it's what probably happened. And so when you don't have to have these, but when you have extra criteria, it gives extra bonus points. Because if historians find an ancient text and they read it, absent other information that contradicts it, like Egypt saying that they conquered somebody when everybody else says they lost the battle just to make the Pharaoh look good, then you had reason to question it. But when you find an ancient text, you give it the benefit of the doubt. But with these criteria of authenticity, it gives extra assurance, and that's when the skeptics start coming around understanding it. So early, meaning it was written early. A lot of ancient history we don't have. I mean, we don't have any original text from the Bible. It's all from the multiple copies that happened shortly after. Papyrus lasts about 100 years. And we have nothing on the Caesars. We've got nothing on anybody else from antiquity. I'll back up just a second. Multiple, we want to have more than one if possible. Embarrassing, it's always glowing. If you say something about yourself that isn't true. I'm not going to do that right now because I want to win the debate. But if I were to say something about myself that's embarrassing, you tend to believe it. And then hostile, just like James and Paul, a hostile witness. When Gil told me that we were very Christian at our church, and I tell him that you were very free-thinking here, that's coming from a somewhat hostile, although we're buddies, source, so you can believe me on that one. So just so you know how it compares, the four Gospels, you may reject them, but historians just don't do that out of hand. You have four sources, primary sources for the biography of what Rome, the best Rome had to offer in historiography, and they are 1 to 4 reports on each of the Caesars, and we take that seriously. And by the way, they were all in good favor with the emperor. They weren't, as the allegation goes, where your non-Christian sources. They're not. I'm not going to ask where your non-Roman sources. It made no sense in history to write about somebody or give a biography if you didn't have any care about it. And this is generous because I got where the historians were at age 20. But the time gap is between 28 and 134 years where these historians were documenting the lives of the Caesars. And by the way, none of us exist today. It's all in copies. So I'll ask Dr. Shapiro to present what other explanations we have for the 3 facts that we know: that Jesus died by crucifixion, that followers actually had appearances that they believed were the risen Jesus, and then thirdly, that Paul and James converted to Christianity after fighting it and being skeptical. So I'm going to say that, absent any other rebuttal, that Christianity best explains these 4 aspects of reality that we all have to deal with in the human condition, and that all rival hypotheses fail to account. And unless or until Dr. Shapiro does so, we are intellectually bound to at least consider Christianity. See, I'm not here to compel you. I'm not here to convert you. I'm here to converse with you. So I really hope that you take this, think about it, write down some good questions, and let's have a good conversation. Thank you.
All set. You're going to see, I gotta make sure I don't run over here. Quite a difference in approach to answering the question, does Christianity best explain reality? Obviously, I'm going to say no. And let's get right to it. What is the crux of the problem? Science and religion are incompatible because they have different methods for getting knowledge about reality. They have different ways of assessing the reliability of that knowledge, and in the end arrive at conflicting conclusions about the universe. This is from an excellent book called Faith and Fact by Professor Jerry Coyne. I recommend it highly. The difference between Christians and scientists in explaining reality can be summarized in how each party would answer the question, how would I know if I was wrong? So, where do we start? Well, we start with Christianity. And I'm going to tell a lot of people a lot of what they know. Maybe some people will just put a fine point on it. Christianity is the faith religion based on the person and teachings of Jesus Christ, its beliefs and practices. It is the world's largest religion with over 2.4 billion followers, or 1/3 of the global population. And the belief that Jesus is simultaneously God, his Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's called the Trinity. He is also the Savior of humanity, whose coming as the Messiah, the Christ, was prophesied in the Old Testament. So, the question at hand is, does the religion, and rephrasing it, does the religion based on the person and teachings of Jesus Christ make plain and comprehensible everything that has existed, exists, or will exist? Oh, and by the way, these slides are going to be on our website, Freethought Arizona, so don't frantically take notes. You will have the opportunity to go through them in the comfort of your home and peruse over them. So I don't want you to feel, because I'm going to be moving along pretty fast here. Got a lot to say. If so, Christianity needs to show that our reality requires the existence and actions of a specific God for its explanation, be consistent with what we already know, be independently testable, and have survived such tests, and make predictions that come true. In other words, it must provide evidence that the world works exactly as expected if the Christian God were in charge of the universe. Christians have a lot of work ahead of them to satisfy that claim. Could a Christian explanation of reality be correct? Of course it could be. But that said, it must live up to the same standards as any other type of correct explanation. It must demonstrate explanatory power, how well it explains the facts, explanatory scope, the number of facts it explains, and that its claims can be tested. However, Christians should know, when you get into this argument with a secularist or scientist, that the natural or scientific explanations have had an excellent track record in explaining our reality. They work, they make sense, and have been consistently right. They have systematically replaced religious explanations of reality. No Christian explanations of reality have proven to be correct. I'm going to repeat. No Christian explanations of reality have proven to be correct. Everyone proposed has either failed or is not testable. What do I mean by that? Here are some that have failed. The creationism, intelligent design, as a better model than evolution by natural selection, failed miserably. Diseases are caused by demons. Read your Bible. It's always caused by demons. We know that's not true. Dead bodies can be revived. We've never been able to reproduce that. And this issue of people with near-death experiences, the key word there is near. And we know it has to do with oxygen deprivation and a whole bunch of scientific stuff, but no one has come back from the dead. There are some things that are untestable, like natural disasters. Is that God's punishment? Well, how would you know? You're going to have a whole cohort of scientific experiments. You're going to cause disasters here. We'll say it is God's punishment. We'll have disasters here. There's just no way to test it. Prayer responses. Christians, you know what you're told. When you pray, God will always answer your prayers. But the answer could be yes, it could be no, or it could be not now. Wait. Well, how do you test whether a prayer has been answered or not? Either negatively, positively, or not right now. And of course, heaven or hell. No one's let us know. No one has come back from, quote, the other side. So, if all Christian explanations have consistently failed over the course of history, doesn't that mean that Christianity cannot best explain reality? Yes, that's probably the case. But why is that right? Because theistic explanations are very strange. They assert a completely new kind of entity, a specific God, not just any run-of-the-mill God, but a specific God in a new kind of location, the supernatural. We have no clue what that would be. To wit, an indescribable and incomprehensible being and place. Consider this quote. The weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportional to its strangeness. Christians, you're on notice. Therefore, Christians are duty-bound to now provide, 1, convincing evidence that a supernatural realm exists, first things first, and within it, a particular deity. You're duty-bound to describe in detail the supernatural realm and the deity within it. And you need to make each comprehensible, no incoherent kind of descriptions. describe it. And to give coherent reasons why Christians alone have this unique access to each of these entities. Secular humanists, we're fascinated by the sense that you have this inside track to the supernatural, to the deity that's controlling the world. We don't know how you do it. Please explain. Predictions. Explanations are tested, in part, by their predictions. And I'm not talking about prophecy here. You know, we bristle when we hear that prophecy is one way to say there's a truth in the Bible. I would like someone to tell me what prophecy could have been said back then that they did not have any kind of knowledge of. For example, like in 2,000 years, there'll be something called the internet. Or in 2,000 years, there'll be something called vaccines. Give us something that's worthy of the word prophecy, not just something that, you know, and this river was there, and look, lo and behold, the river is there. Not impressive. So, if the Christian God is all-powerful, all-knowing, good, all-present, just, all-merciful, all-immutable, it means doesn't change, holy, righteous, sovereign, and there are more attributes, but I'm just taking the top 10 here, then this deity's desires, intentions, values, goals, and actions should be consistent, understandable, and generally predictable. I mean, if you have a family member who you lovingly describe a certain way, and that person acted totally different, i.e. a Thanksgiving meal or something like that this weekend, you say, what is going on with that person? The predictability has to be a reflection of his attributes. Christians must now predict how their God would and would not act. For example, a fair and logical prediction based on his attributes would be that he would not create or allow gratuitous suffering. But this kind of suffering has always existed, hundreds of thousands of years before Jesus came to earth. Then either this God, if this suffering has existed, is either irrational, meaning he's acting inconsistent with his attributes, or he just does not exist. Therefore, this God claim is testable and falsifiable. Let's talk for a second about rationality. It's an important term. It's the quality or state of being reasonable, based on facts, implies the conformity of one's beliefs with one's reasons to believe, or of one's actions with one's reasons for actions. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Christianity's God should be rational. If he is not acting rationally, how could humans determine his actions are understandable and explanatory? I'm going to read that again. It's important. If he is not acting rationally, how could humans determine his actions are understandable and explanatory? Now back to the question at hand. What does Christianity need to explain first? Well, let's start with two primary or essential questions all humans should ask about reality. Why is this something rather than nothing? And what is it all about? Fair? Christianity must further explain why and how did their God bring this state of affairs into existence, which encompasses both of those points, those questions. Christians usually answer, well, God wanted something rather than nothing. He wanted creation. It's all about glorifying Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, having a relationship with him, repenting sins, and following their meaning and purpose he gave you. I listen to Robert Furrow. I listen to Scott Richards. I know what the party line is, so to speak. I don't say that disrespectfully, but I know what is said over and over and over again. Non-theist answers to 1 and 2 are, we don't know, and we don't know. And we're not going to make something up. The nature of the answers, let's talk about that. Christians' answers are speculative and wishful because you have no clue as to why there's something rather than nothing or what it's all about. Non-theist answers are honest and humble because to date there are no rational explanations for existence. We can't know what we don't know. Additionally, the non-theist answers show respect for the profound nature of these questions and the humility that humans possess only a limited knowledge capacity, and the answers to some questions may always be, unfortunately, unknowable. But that's refreshing, because that's what it is. As my wife says, it is what it is. We should all agree that explanations are important. And this is very important. If it is important, it is worth verifying. So, what would make Christian explanations of reality verifiable? Well, let's start off with if they're accurate. They have to be accurate scientifically, historically, experientially, and theologically. But they're not. Science has found, and this I could go on for hours on this, but this is just a snippet. Science has found no evidence of deities or supernatural realms, preconditions for deities, angels, devils, spirits, and heavens and hells. You've got to be able to put these entities somewhere, and that's in the supernatural. And the best scientists and philosophers, we have not found any realm outside of our natural universe. Now, that's not to say if we come up with new dimensions of our universe that it's supernatural. No, it's just part of our universe. And there could be multiverses. We're only one of many universes. Science has not verified miracles. Now, there's the informal definition of miracle, and there's the formal definition of miracle. When you saw your child born, oh my goodness, it's a miracle. When the traffic suddenly moved on Oracle, it's a miracle. When a person survives a crash, it's a miracle. That is the informal usage of the word miracle. It just means a wondrous event. But some people misuse miracle for the word remarkable, awesome, unexpected. I'm going to use the word miracle, if it's going to make any sense, to the question at hand. Miracles are supernatural interventions in both the natural world, both claimed and predicted by Christianity. I'm talking about bringing dead people back. I'm talking about walking on water. You get the picture? You know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a miracle. And no verification of scientific claims in the Bible have been found, such as a young earth, the talking animals, a human being becoming a pillar of salt, a worldwide flood, dead people returning to life, demons causing diseases, etc. Historical claims have also not been verified. Plausible arguments can be made that the historical Jesus did not exist. And we could go on about that. We don't have the time, but there have been debates on that subject, and there are valid arguments on both sides. But assuming he existed, what he is purported to have said is speculative, since there was no way to have accurately recorded him. How would you have recorded Jesus? You know, we talk about, remember, Jesus wrote nothing. What you see in the Gospels and Paul and all, that is what someone said that he said. That, in the law and investigations, is called hearsay, inadmissible. But, you know, and then there were some strange things when Jesus was talking to himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. How does someone know what he said? That is a crucial issue about just what did he say and how do we know what he said. And some historical claims must also be scientifically true. The resurrection of Jesus, which is the central core of the Christian religion, cannot be classified only as one form of truth. It cannot be a Christian truth without, at the same time, being a historical truth, unless language loses all its meaning. And it cannot be historically true unless it is scientifically true. Don't talk about the resurrection as an absolute historical event that's been witnessed. Talk more about it as a scientific event. Really? Really? Additionally, Christianity cannot best explain reality because, listen carefully, the Gospels, the foundational documents, are based on hearsay. The earliest one, Jesus died, give or take a couple of years, in about the year 33. The earliest Gospel of Mark was written in the 60s or 70s. And even though it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is Mark that's the earliest one. Of a man who spoke in Aramaic. Remember, and we did not record what he said, but he spoke in Aramaic, whose supposed words were then translated into an ancient Greek called koine, which was then translated into Latin, which was then into a 17th century English that produced the King James Bible. What could go wrong there? And the original Gospels have never been found, and their true authorship is unknown. Yes, we have 5,500 manuscripts, copies of copies of copies of copies. but they're all based on an original copy that doesn't exist. They think it does, but it is a copy of a copy. And then as it copied through 1,000 years till the year 1000, changes were made, things were added, there were forgeries, there was a whole load of problems. So the authorship of the Gospels, for example, we don't know of any Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These are just names that were given by later editors. There was no corroboration of Jesus' life and actions by any unbiased historian in the entire first century. I'll take issue with Dan, what he said about that. Much of Christianity's dogma was not derived from Scripture or revelation. This is very important. Listen carefully. It was not derived from Scripture or revelation, but from a consensus of opinion designed to quell dissent within the church. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, was convened by Emperor Constantine in 325. It's almost 300 years after Jesus died, to settle the issues about the divinity of Jesus, having to do with whether he's God or man or a combination of both, and the reality of the Trinity. Despite dissent, both issues were affirmed. In other words, the issues of Christian truth were settled by a vote. I'm not impressed. As for verifying miracles, historians cannot verify a miracle. They can only describe what most probably happened. They can't recreate the past. They can only describe what they have documentation, what most probably happened. And miracles are the least probable things that could have happened. Experientially, our world, and as far as we can tell, the rest of the universe, works exactly as expected if there were no intervening deities. And it works with an apparent, unfortunate, total, and exquisite indifference to all that exists. I defy anyone to tell me that the world works exactly as if the Christian God were sovereign. Verified. Righteous Christians do not necessarily lead healthier, happier, or more fulfilled lives as would be expected if their God was true. Wouldn't you expect that? When those two nuns in Alabama were stabbed to death, I just about lost it. I said, you can't get more holy people than nuns who are feeding the poor and taking care of the poor. God could have stopped that stabbing. Verified. Most Christians do not follow the deity's directives to commit murder and genocide, enslave fellow human beings, torture, rape, and destroy families. If that's objective morality, that's what the God is doing. Read the Old Testament especially. Christians override these orders because they know better, and they don't want to go to jail. Most of us do not do things we know inside are not moral to do, period. And this brings another verification that human morality is a product of our culture and biology. It is not based on religion. Far from it. It's actually based on, hold on, secularism. Theologically, it's also inaccurate. Hundreds of Christianities within Christianity confirm that this religion is subjective, segmented, and unstable. It's like a house of cards built on quicksand. Hundreds of different Christianities. Why? Because of hundreds of different interpretations. It says a lot. It speaks volumes. Now, this is verified by common sense. Evil and suffering cannot be explained if the Christian God is rational. Let's have an appeal to logic. An all-knowing, all-powerful, good, loving, merciful deity would not have created a world with earthquakes, volcanoes, plagues, free will, and the law of the jungle if he knew, as he had to, that his creation, both animal and human, would suffer terribly. Tell me you don't think about the poor animals in the middle of these forest fires in California and in Colorado that by no fault of their own are going to burn to death because they just happen to be in that forest and there's no way out. They did not commit original sin. Why is not God not quenching that fire or somehow taking them out of it if he's not going to take the humans out of it at least? This is another testable issue. Indeed, why does he allow it to occur? Can he stop it? I mean, he's God. Christianity's explanations for evil and suffering are incoherent and incomprehensible. I hear this all the time. They include, because this question comes up on the radio shows, it comes up from many Christians who are thinking, I need an explanation for this. Well, pastors and others will say something along the lines of, and I have 4 examples here. Well, we all deserve evil and suffering because we're all sinners. This original sin concept of what Adam and Eve did has tainted us going forward. Or we don't know God's ultimate purpose. Possibly, but you know what he's doing right now. We live in a speck of time compared to an eternity in heaven. If I took your arm and twisted it to the point where I'm about to snap it off, you wouldn't care much whether you're going to be in heaven for an eternity. It's like, stop doing that right now. And if a child is suffering from malaria and all that, let's talk about the suffering of the here and now. And man has been given free will. Boy, we could talk a lot about that. But free will should not be more powerful than God. These explanations are all, to say the least, unimpressive and frankly insulting to human intelligence. Christianity's shortcoming in this regard is that it cannot provide more than beliefs or opinions. Why? Because its theological foundation, faith-based thinking, only leads to beliefs and opinions. And let's define it as fixed ideas that lack certainty, because if you had something that had certainty, it wouldn't be called a belief or an opinion, it would be called a fact, and not factual knowledge. Beliefs and opinions are poor substitutes for factual knowledge, which are justified true beliefs or accurate statements about reality. Christianity's other dilemma is that it can't self-check or verify its beliefs are true when, unlike science, that has further testing and peer review and reproducibility and falsifiability, there are no mechanisms within the faith, nothing in the Bible itself, to confirm its own claims. It also does not accept any outside criticisms, as I will find out today. It places faith, belief in the absence of evidence or in spite of evidence to the contrary, over reason or science as a source of knowledge about our real world and how it works. Is that reliable? Christian explanations are based on faith, dogma, authority, and confirmation bias. Now, scientists get accused of that too, but that gets found out real fast. But the confirmation bias in biblical explanations is the tendency to see as true what you want to be true. Christianity mistakes and confuses beliefs for facts. Therefore, it cannot be explanatory. Christian's fatal flaw is that, and this goes to what Dan was first talking about, it starts with a conclusion that a specific deity, existence unproven, had some kind of revelation to someone, something, someone, group of people, but that's subjective, that's not objective. That became scripture, which is inerrant or without error, because this deity's still existence unproven is infallible or incapable of error. And that produces doctrine. And doctrine is the belief or opinion, is not factual. The simple definition of doctrine is a set of ideas or beliefs that are taught or believed to be true. Caution, especially parents, teaching ideas and beliefs as fact is indoctrination. Teaching fact as fact is education. By the way, our camp does not teach secular humanism as fact, but as a worldview, philosophy, or life stance to consider as the most logical and useful one to live by. Christianity has no pathway to factual knowledge, yet it pretends it does. Faith is an imposter. It is not what it appears to be and doesn't deliver what it promises. Try to tell me one thing that faith has given us in the last 100 years that has brought us modernity. Now, by the way, I'm at my 25-minute mark. I'm going to go into my rebuttal time because what I have to say is important. So I'll keep you posted on it. Therefore, the best explanations of reality are based on factual knowledge. Factual knowledge trumps beliefs because a person having factual knowledge has a justified affirmation of something, an accurate, at least a better understanding of reality. And what's its importance? Factual knowledge is as close as humans can come to possessing a certainty or a scientific truth. A proven pathway to factual knowledge is the scientific method. Non-theists trust reason-based thinking as embodied in the scientific method. We see something happen, an observation, we have a hypothesis, a belief about it, we test it, and we come to a conclusion. Because reason, as embodied in this approach, has proven reliable over and over again to provide factual knowledge. What is reason? Very important because it's the foundation of science. It's the power of the mind to think and understand in a logical way, specifically the power of comprehending, inferring, or thinking especially in orderly, rational ways. The power to exercise, the proper exercise of the mind and the sum of intellectual powers. The scientific method is honest, it's objective, it follows facts. It's neutral, It does not have an agenda. It's a pathway to explain and understand reality that is universally accepted because of its history of getting right. We don't question airplanes built in China or bridges built. It's all the same science. And conclusions can change or be rejected pending new facts or information. In summary, the secular humanist position is that reason-based thinking is the correct way to think because its conclusions are testable, reproducible, and falsifiable. It can make predictions. Its conclusions are explanatory. Also, its conclusions have survived the severest scrutiny and best rational criticisms. Reason-based thinking, as embodied in the scientific method, is trustworthy. What evidence verifies reason-based thinking is trustworthy? Well, it has brought us all the trappings of modernity: medicine, engineering, agriculture, cars, planes, trains, roads, bridges, tunnels. It works. Reality check. Nations which have the highest standard of living and which self-report as the happiest are secular, based on factual knowledge. Steve, I'm going into the 10-minute rebuttal, but I'm going to take it off on that. We decided. Since and because of 9/11, which opened the floodgates to this, hundreds of books have been written on the incoherencies, contradictions, and questionable origins and the claims of Christianity. The same cannot be said of science. This is a quote: "Knowledge acquired by religion is at odds not only with scientific knowledge, but with that professed by other religions. In the end, religion's methods, unlike those of science, are useless in understanding reality." The question we pose to Christians about whether their religion best explains reality, and I'm almost done, is, does it really matter whether what you believe about Christianity's explanatory power is true, or don't you care? If it does matter, then you must justify your beliefs by verifying them as factual knowledge. If it doesn't, then you must justify why belief is better than factual knowledge for explaining reality. What worldview best explains reality or the real world? While there is no one source that is perfect, the worldview based on reason, experience, and the power of science is the best choice for explaining and understanding our reality. And that worldview, in my opinion, is secular humanism. Thank you very much. And I'm about 4 minutes into my rebuttal, so I have 6.
You're going to have an opportunity to ask questions, but they must be in writing, preferably. Okay, I heard that. We will pass. Some of you have forms which we ran out of to write your questions on. We'll collect those momentarily. And we also have some blank 3x5s that we'll pass out for those of you who didn't get forms to write questions on. I frankly doubt that we'll get to nearly all of the questions, so keep them brief and mention who you would like to ask that question of. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Gil. Start my 10-minute rebuttal here. Just everybody can rest assured that I am not going to ask you to use faith in any part of this presentation. I'm asking you purely to do as Dr. Shapiro and our Bible itself says, is to reason and to just examine where the truth leads. So I'm going to take this 10 minutes just to kind of rehash and trace back the threads of this debate. I extended to Dr. Shapiro the offer to have the debate be, does Christianity or secular humanism best describe reality? We settled on Christianity. So there's not a secular humanism isn't going to take up a lot of my rebuttal time. I'm going to be specific to where it comes across and intersects and intertwines with the 4 basic ideas and concepts we have to wrestle with as part of our reality. The first thing you may remember is I presented the universe and how do we explain the arrival of the universe. And Dr. Shapiro gave no response to that. He did say that there are some things that we don't know. For the origination of biological life on this planet, he did cite a book by Jerry Coyne, who knows something about this matter, but didn't respond to the arrival of intelligence or how we explain it outside of a mind. To the problem of evil, I'm glad that he did present some response to that. In that he said that God does nothing to stop suffering. We may not always know why God does allow suffering. In fact, there's a lot of things that we don't see where there's evil in this world and there's suffering. But my argument was that we have to explain it and ground it on something. Sometimes we can see it. Emmett Till was beaten to a pulp, shot and killed, and his mom wanted an open casket. Anybody from around that era who has studied the civil rights movement knows that that picture launched a movement that changed our world. The entire Western world changed. Thousands, if not millions, of Black Americans and Europeans and everywhere else have been spared the brutality of the Southern racism that our country experienced. And that is progress. That is only progress that we can measure in an objective sense, not in our culture, right? There was real change. We might have agreed on some things. Right now we agree on some things that are probably immoral. But we can only progress if there's something that transcends and there's a different kind of morality. Adam Walsh was brutally killed, executed, and unspeakably tortured before he died. But his dad was John Walsh. John Walsh launched a campaign, became this spokesperson and this figurehead for America's Most Wanted. And how many thousands, perhaps millions of kids are spared the same fate that that boy had experienced? The picture I couldn't talk about was two girls that almost a year ago were shot and killed by their father here in Tucson. My son was in kindergarten with Haley. That's why I couldn't talk about it. But I don't know why that's allowed. I don't know. Because to know it, as a believer in God, I would have to be in God's position to know. And we are so honored to see when there is some redemption in death. And from a theistic worldview, we can see some progress as a result sometimes. But not all the time. I've only been here 40 years, so I don't have the perspective on the whole world. God can see all of cosmic history. But you notice this isn't an objection I'm bringing up. I'm using evil to show for God. For the intellectual problem of evil to work, Dr. Shapiro has to show three things. Number one, that God had no right to take the life of a human, and that we can understand why he would have done so. Number two, that no such justification is even possible. He's assuming it's impossible. Oftentimes, it's a rhetorical device to show how awful something be, and there can't possibly be a reason for it. But there's no argument given for that. It's just an assumption. And number three, that God's injustice is objectively wrong. As I mentioned, by what? According to who? There's nothing that transcends culture that we can point to. So while it really has this emotional force, the problem of evil ultimately points more to God because there's much more of an explanation. The third or fourth part, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that his followers had appearances they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus, and that the skeptics Paul and James converted, were not directly attacked, other than to say that scholars say that that Jesus may not have existed. I want to read real quick a Bart Ehrman quote, if I've got it. He was getting an award from Dan Barker in 2009, and somebody in the crowd said, "What are we going to do with these skeptics who say that, or these crazy Christians who think that Jesus existed?" And with the award in his hand and Dan Barker to his side, he said, I'm sorry. I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. He said one author knows about, that he knows about knew Jesus' brother. That the reason for thinking Jesus exists is because he's abundantly attested in early sources, and that early and independent sources certainly indicate that Jesus existed. So that is an issue that is on the very, very fringe. We can point, like I said, to there's three scholars who are active, have active professor jobs at University of Southern California, USC, Northwestern University, and Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, who all deny the Holocaust and are published on that. So I can point to that all day, but it's not going to convince you that the Holocaust didn't happen. We have abundant sources that say that it did. History just doesn't work that way. History relies on sources, and we can't look at it from our snobby 21st century CSI Miami kind of perspective. We have to look at it like the scholars do. And believe it or not, the New Testament scholars give much less credit to the Bible than historians do. And historians constantly are saying that what we have in the Gospels is gold. But we don't need to go just to the Gospels. We also have, like I said, even though there's no non-Roman sources citing the Caesars, we do have non-Christian sources citing Jesus. It's scant. It doesn't talk about the biography to the extent like the Gospels do, not even close. But Josephus has it mentioned twice in Antiquities 18 and Antiquities 20. Now, in Antiquities 18, it speaks at length and glowing, like a Jew, Josephus, thinks that Jesus was the Messiah. Probably not. I think most scholars, the consensus is that it was a Christian interpolation, that they changed it. But that's the consensus. There's three views, that it's all Christian interpolation, a tampered interpolation, or a tampered document, or it's completely authentic. Most of them fall in the middle to where it's interpolated slightly. But there's a quote that was found in Arabic, and Muslims certainly are not inclined to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. It reads like this. At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of Christians so named after him has not disappeared to this day. He goes on in 20 to speak of James being executed, James the brother of Jesus, and has no other explanation of who Jesus was. So we assume that he had previously mentioned Jesus somewhere. Other things that are not relevant to today's topic, let's see here, were miracles. Now, he's borrowing what David Hume had called a miracle. It's the least probable event is by definition, that's what a miracle is. And Bart Ehrman does the same exact thing. However, you are ignoring, both Hume and Ehrman are both ignoring the background information, the context. I tell you, a year ago, to say a man 5'11" named Dan Grossenbach would be standing here in Val Auditorium would be the least probable event by definition. But that is ignoring the fact that I teach apologetics, that I got to meet a new friend, Gil Shapiro, and that I've been invited here. So you can't ignore the facts of history to just categorize away by calling it faith what we know is facts. So retracing what we have tonight is I presented intentionally 4 facts that are not disputed, and what logically and necessarily follows from the creation of the universe, the arrival of biological information, the problem of evil existing, and lastly, the facts that we know about Jesus. And I'll save the rest of my time. Thank you.
Six minutes to the dot. Okay, Dan, I take your challenge. And by the way, the fact that you're presenting today is not a miracle. Yes, it is awesome. It is remarkable. It's unlikely. But it's not a miracle. It does not defy physical laws that you're here. I got to stick with my definition. I'm sunk. Okay, Dan threw out the gauntlet. The universe. Who the heck knows? We can take what we have out there and take it back to within nanoseconds of the Big Bang, 13, 14 billion years ago. But science has not been able to understand what caused it, what was there before it, if that word before even makes any sense. We just don't know. But we're not going to make up that it had to be caused by an uncaused cause God, because this in law is called special pleading, meaning you talk about, well, everything had a cause except God. Special pleading. God did not have to have a cause. Well, not so fast. Who made God? Were there other gods? Were there a committee of gods? Was our universe through a wormhole from another universe in the multiverse? We just don't know. Scientists will be the first to tell you that. Biological information. This is an interesting concept that Dan brings up, because he talks about, our Earth is 4.5 billion years ago. About 3.5 billion years ago, we think, is when life first started. And then it sat on its butt for about another billion years, and then started to get a little bit more complex. Well, that's evolution. Evolution is a deal breaker, or it should be for Christianity. Either our universe and all living things are a top-down creation somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, or it's a bottom-up creation starting about 4.5 billion years ago, at least for our Earth. You can't have it both ways. Pick a lane, as they say. The other thing is that science has shown that when you have certain atoms that become certain molecules, that become something called polypeptides, that become polypeptides, kind of around between polypeptides and amino acids, there's a little bit of vibration going on that these electrically charged entities start to do. And not only do they start to vibrate a little bit, they start to fold on one another. And some do it in some ways, and some do it in other ways, and all that. But we're pretty sure that life started by certain chemicals on this planet that just interacted, and hit or miss, some started to become more and more complex. And I think Dan is confusing the word information with the word instruction when he's talking about DNA. You know, DNA, it's 4 components, and it's the way the lattice is and the helix and all that. And they're instructions to each other. To use the word information, yeah, you could use that. But we don't see anything supernatural with that, because there was such a long period of time that this all took place. And by the way, each of these topics, I could go on more and more, but I got to kind of go away to different ones. Evil. I'd like to know, you know, the idea of this absolute morality and a loving God, an all-powerful God, all-knowing, would actually allow evil to take place. I brought up in my talk, that's irrational. I'd like Dan to kind of deal with that issue about irrationality. And is this God the best one to talk about absolute moral standards? If you've read the Old Testament especially, he's kind of psychopathic, no offense intended, kind of in need of anger management. And you know, we have a kinder, nicer God in the Newer Testament, and Jesus comes up with some very wonderful things that he says. But he also says things like, you know what, follow me, leave your family behind. And the kicker for us is this thing where he seems to be kind of nice, but at the end he says, you know what, if you don't believe in me, you're going to hell. I mean, you know, to become a Christian, it's one sentence. I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I repent my sins. You're in. Catholics deal a little bit more with work. They've got good works. But in evangelical fundamentalism, it is one sentence. So to use the extreme example, if Hitler had a deathbed confession that, you know what, I was wrong. I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I repent my sins, he would be in heaven. And the 6 million of my lineage that died in the camps would not. That is not common sense. And it's not fair. People should be responsible for their actions. As a matter of fact, we have in our camp this idea of the resurrection as what we call vicarious redemption or substitutionary atonement, meaning taking on to yourself, which was a very nice thing Jesus did in some respects, all your sins. But that's terrible. People should be responsible. Our justice system would fall apart if people went before a judge and said, you know what? I'm sorry. I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Judge said, well, to a serial killer, go free. No, our justice system would not work like that. I am at 6 minutes. I'm going to stop.
Well, I have to admire the multiplicity of questions that we have. And we didn't have time to sort them all out properly as we would like to have logically. But we're going beyond logic this morning anyway. So I took a real brief one to start with, and we'll try to do better later. One gentleman here asks of each of you, what caused God?
You definitely go first.
Okay, all right. Well, in my presentation, I wasn't coming up with anything new. It's part of the theology and the position of who God is, that God is an uncreated being. He is the I am. It's the present tense of the Greek or the Hebrew before that, saying that it is someone who has always existed, that there is no creation. You would get to this infinite regress, and perhaps that's why the critic likes to lodge the complaint that, well, who created God, and then who created that, and who created that. The same problem goes, which is why Dawkins at the end of Expelled proposes panspermia to explain that alien life embedded us with the DNA to explain the information. It's why he doesn't like panspermia, because then where do you get the aliens, and it goes infinitely. The more interesting point is that it's a question nobody's asking. The skeptic, the atheist, doesn't believe in God, and then the Christian says that God isn't caused. So it might be interesting, mental project, but nobody is alleging that God was created. So that would be my answer.
Humans.
Okay. All right. Okay. We got a question for both. What are the practical and real things we can agree on and work together on as Christians and secular humanists to make meaningful and positive changes in our society?
That's a good question.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, we all need to live together. Divorce is not acceptable. Maybe in Texas, they've always wanted to secede. But we do need to live together. And as I mentioned, there are going to be things we're going to be able to negotiate and compromise on for the sake of getting along, and there are other irreconcilable things. But that's the purpose of what Dan and I are doing. We get it. We have different worldviews. We come at the world differently. My life is wrapped around some things. Dan's life and family wrapped around other things. But we send our children to school. We shop in the same places. We have all these things that we have to do together. And as I mentioned, all these different things like separation of church and state, abortion and all that, we'd like to set aside time to tackle each of these individually now that we know where we all stand. So that's the thing that we have to explore. How do we do it? How do you compromise? How do you negotiate? And how do you deal with the irreconcilable differences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's kind of why we're here. And I think that most of the time, Christians and atheists or Jews or Muslims or agnostics, whoever, can come together with agreement and make society work. There are times, though, when it's a controversial issue, and those are always based on higher level fundamental values and beliefs. And that's why this is so important to start at that level. What do we believe about God and our universe and reality and Jesus? And once we address those, that's going to color our worldview. But Christians went the first 300 years not having any political power at all. So it's one of those things where I know, we can make it. And atheists and agnostics, I know, can work together. And it doesn't matter if we ground our values and our beliefs on different things. Like, for instance, human value. I believe humans are created in the image of God, and that gives an infinite worth. But I haven't met an atheist or an agnostic yet that says humans don't matter. So we can both agree that humans matter. I would just say a humanist should be a theistic humanist if you really want to have intellectual satisfaction.
Good try. Just one thing in my generation, when I was a kid, Mom would say, listen, when so-and-so, no politics, no religion. And people who are in my generation, that was a phrase to go by. In polite company, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion. And there's a certain logic to it. But we need to talk about those things, and we need to talk about it respectfully and with an understanding that we all kind of come at the world a little differently, but we all have to live in it together peacefully and happily. One of the things that my camp is just starting to get used to is just because someone has, and you saw it a little bit of my tone, just because someone is religious, and I grew up in a religious home with a religious father and mother, that just because your belief is religious, it doesn't privilege it from being criticized or scrutinized. It's an idea like anything else. It's not quarantined off from rational discussion. You need to get into the idea. Why do you believe this? Why? And you saw a little bit of the back and forth with Dan and me on this issue. So we need to say that religious discussion and dialogue is not privileged, that we do need to open up to each other and talk about what's on our mind. And Dan was really wonderful in encouraging me. As I said, Gil, do it. Speak what's on your mind. Don't pull any punches. Be straightforward. And as it said in that newspaper article, when I finally found the smelling salts, I was able to compose myself because it's not something that our camp is used to. And I give Dan all the credit.
Okay. This one's a little more involved. How do you know? I can hardly read it, but it says, I think, how do you morally and ethically justify raising children with religious superstition and mythology?
Is that one for me? Well, I suppose I'm doing that, but you know what? If it was false, that would be a problem. I'm convinced that it's true for reasons that, in part, that I've given, and really, I think that if you're an atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, if you're sincere with your beliefs, I don't see what would be immoral in sharing that with other people, right? If you're really convinced of something, like I really think the Green Bay Packers, maybe this is a bad example, are going to win this Sunday, I would want to tell my family and say, come on, guys, let's go watch the game and cheer them on. But if you really believe something, or if you believe in a medical condition, somebody's overeating, and it may offend them if you give them advice or tell them your concern that maybe they're being unhealthy, I think even if it's unpopular, if you really are convinced that it's true, that's perfectly moral, regardless of your position.
I think children are being a little victimized in this, in the sense that they don't have the power to know right and wrong. They watch cartoons. It's all of a sudden living that they know that, the Roadrunner, when he goes off the cliff, really is going to fall, and you can't just jump off of it and fly. Children learn experientially and empirically what is real and what is not, and they try to, as they're going along, separate fact from fiction. And as I said in my slides, when you teach belief and ideas that are not factual, and you have to say Christianity is a belief and it's an opinion. It is not necessarily factual. I mean, the factual things, well, they're not even factual things about Christianity because there's so many different Christianities. But when you teach that as fact, you are indoctrinating. And, it's one thing we indoctrinate in the United States when we have the Pledge of Allegiance. We're indoctrinating to our country. Well, we all kind of have this collective notion that, yes, I love my country. I believe my country is a great country, and that's a positive indoctrination. But when you indoctrinate things that, only 1/3 of the world believe, and they could be wrong, parents need to know that, and it's the children that suffer. Sometimes our camp calls this educational malpractice or psychological malpractice, when children, at no fault of their own, are being inculcated, ingrained in something that's the parents' issue. And then they grow up, and what do? It becomes a very emotional problem, and the circuitry in their brain for religion, and that particular religion, is oftentimes hardwired.
Okay, next question is for Dan. If God is all-powerful, why doesn't he eliminate evil, also known as the devil? Because he doesn't eliminate evil, does that mean that he is not all-powerful?
Right, the age-old question, right? Well, the devil, whether he eliminates the devil or not, that's a question that I can't answer, why he doesn't eliminate the devil. I mean, there's things that we don't, I didn't come here with every answer to be able to give you. And that's actually kind of an in-house debate with Christians. And if you look at the core Christianity, there's different views of hell and how the devil is involved with our daily lives. But the question of why does he allow evil, I think, is probably what most people are really wondering. If God, there are cases, like I explained, where God does redeem and make something out of what seems unjustified evil. And it's not that we see it all the time. But imagine in a world if he did do it all of the time, if when an attacker came with a knife and as he's stabbing you, turned it into this rubbery toy knife. It'd be a cartoon world like the Roadrunner that Dr. Shapiro just mentioned. And it wouldn't be a real world. It would be irrational. So there are actual consequences, and this is a universe of order. For Christian theism, I know Dr. Shapiro doesn't like the free will defense, but if you're a creating being and you're creating a being that you really want to love you, you could go one option and just program them to do nothing but love you, like in the Stepford Wives movie from years ago. But that wouldn't be truly love. The definition of love, it has to be freely loving. If I put a gun to somebody's head and say, love me, it's not going to be love, right? It's going to be a response to a forced scenario. So I think that as soon as you allow that freedom, there's that built-in liability that it could go wrong. If it couldn't go wrong, it wouldn't be real love.
If heaven is the place where it's total love, no free will, because if people had free will, they would sin, and is such a wonderful place, why didn't God make earth a lot more like heaven?
Well, he did in the beginning. Our understanding is that when he made everything, it was good. Reading through the poetic prose of Genesis, we can tell that he did create a perfect place, and then it became imperfect. And if we don't like evil, then really hate sin, hate bad things that happen, because that's where it comes from. I think that in heaven, we're also without our bodies, which our bodies can create us to do bad things. We have different impulses biologically. When we're in heaven, we're faced with God face to face, saying, "Oh, wow!" And it would be pretty silly. It's like me taking this pen and jabbing it in my eye. Right here, it'd be pretty stupid to do that. Why would you sin when you see the glories of God firsthand? Seems to make sense to me. I could be wrong, but it seems to make sense.
Okay. Next question, rather straightforward, as it's directed to Gil. Gil, do you consider yourself either agnostic or atheist, and why? Identify the difference.
Okay. Let me just define agnosticism. Agnosticism is it's called an epistemological position, meaning it's a position having to do with knowledge. Agnosticism is the position that either, with respect to God, I don't have enough knowledge to make that decision that there is a God, or that whether there is a God is an absolutely unknowable issue. One of those two. Either I don't have the knowledge or it's unknowable per se. To whether there is ultimately a force out there, a God, something that I just don't know about or there's no answer to, I am agnostic. I don't know. I'm humble. I don't know. I can't know. To whether there is a personal God, like the Christian God or the Jewish God or Allah, all the information that I've seen that I find as credible and factual knowledge tells me that although there could be that God, based on what I see in the world, that God would have to be irrational to allow all this to go on. Therefore, I can't believe in a God who is irrational. It's the polar opposites. They're mutually exclusive. So, to a personal God, I am atheistic. As a matter of fact, Christians are atheistic to all the other thousands of gods that have ever percolated through this world, except to one. I just go one step further, or one God further.
Okay. This one's for Dan. How can evangelicals forgive a multiple adulterer, a hate monger, non-believer, but not his female opponent?
Oh, I'm sorry. Repeat that last part there. Do some stretching.
How can the...
Okay.
You got it?
Right. Well, keep in mind, like I said, Christians have not been didn't start off in political power. So they've had to have a lot of people in power that they didn't agree with. So, yeah, you could probably continue that description with lots of things that evangelical Christians would disagree with Donald Trump. I'd have to speak a lot on my own. What I think I can't speak on behalf of all evangelicals, but yeah, he wasn't my man, and here we are. He wasn't yours either. So,
another brief one. I think it was covered, but you may want to draw a distinction a little bit about what is humanism. You used secular humanism a good bit, but what is humanism?
Humanism is it's kind of a life stance, it's a philosophy, it's a worldview that takes into account that we cannot rely on any supernatural influences in our world, and that the ultimate, for example, the Christian position is God is in control, God is sovereign. We take exactly the opposite. We say, you know what, we're in this alone. We as humans need to figure out how to live together, how to solve our problems, and we can't rely on anything outside of the material universe. There was a time where there was something early on at the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933 that dealt a lot with what was called religious humanism. But then as the humanist documents progressed in 1973, that became less of an issue, religious humanism. And the latest one in 2003 didn't have anything about religious humanism at all, because it seemed like it was a little bit of cognitive dissonance to hold on that there's some kind of spiritual entity out there, and yet we rely only on we humans. So that was abandoned, and now we use the term most often secular humanism to emphasize the point that we're talking of this world, and humanism is more of a meaning of getting it all done under the guise of not relying on any supernatural influences.
Okay, here's a comment by Elaine. Did 6 million Jews not pray to be saved?
That's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I can tell you there's times I've prayed and I haven't had what I wanted answered, but to magnify that to 6 million people is tough to swallow. The one thing that helps, I think, when you look at the millions and millions of people who have suffered in the 21st century, whether it's the Holocaust or the extermination of people in all sorts of regimes, it helps a little bit. It's not completely conciliatory, but it helps to know that human suffering is not cumulative. It's experienced badly with one person, but that suffering doesn't multiply by each additional person. The feeling and emotion of hurt is only as much as one person can handle. And the Holocaust is a perfect example of someone who freely took that choice to do what he did to those many people, and was able to convince enough people to come along with him and do what he did. I just don't know how we can call it evil under atheism. Under atheism, that is part of nature, that is part of the natural world. And I just don't see a grounding, and there wasn't one presented today, other than just assuming the conclusion that humans are valuable. The example of my son's friend from kindergarten who was shot by their father, well, lions eat their young, and they don't murder them. But the human being murders their son. Well, the response is, well, he's rational. He should have known that. Known what? What was that he knew? He knew that it's evil, and he knew that it's wrong, and that humans are valuable. Where do we ground that? So under atheism, I don't think we can complain to God that he wasn't answering the prayers. The Christian, just like the secular humanist with other interesting questions, can't always answer everything.
Let me clarify something real fast here. This idea that because one does not believe in a higher power, one can't comment on morality is absolutely false, and I'm not sure why it keeps on coming out. Atheists, first of all, atheism is one sentence, a disbelief in God's end of sentence. Now, there's more to it, obviously. But morality for human beings, at least for secular humanists, is based on what we'll call consequentialism, which is a big word that just means if there's a certain action or statement and all that, what's the consequence of that? And our bottom line is, does it promote well-being, individual well-being, collective well-being? If it's a positive thing, some action, whatever, then we're for it. If it's not, then we're against it. This is not, a rocket scientist kind of thing. We don't use divine morality standards because, first of all, the God that we're talking about, the God of the Bible, has a lot to answer for himself. He is certainly no standard for us. So our decision-making is based on evaluating things. Sometimes it's relative. I mean, in certain religions, there's honor killing that actually is talked about. The ISIS people are following their God's commandments to a T. If you look in the Quran, you will see that beheading, chopping off hands, and all that is something that is said to do in the Quran. They're just following it. So I don't know how this argument can be made that there's some kind of absolute objective morality, especially coming from a deity that has a lot of explaining to do, him or herself. I think the idea of growing up in this world and figuring out what's right and what's wrong based on what the effect of that is a much more mature position to take.
Can I ask you a question? When the first two humans came, or even backing up to the Jurassic period, before people, would have it been unjust to kill and steal rather than to love the first human that you encountered? And why?
I think people learned when they were living together that they had to do certain things so that the community survived. And there were certain basic things like killing and stealing and adultery and all those things that were destructive to the health of the community. And I think, and it's been shown, that that's where our morality derived from. It's our culture and our biology that causes us to behave the way we do. And I bring that out again, is that Christians don't murder people who work on the Sabbath. They don't leave their families. They don't murder their children when the children talk back to them. You know where I'm going with this, because they override those directives of their deity because they do what inside they know is right.
Okay, this one's for Gil, the atheist. In evolution, how do non-living organisms become living?
Oh, if we figured that out, that's a Nobel Prize right there. Right there. This is, see, scientists say, and let me just go back a little bit because this question promotes it. Evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life. Zero. Evolution has to do with once life started, how it progressed. How life started is totally speculative right now. There were experiments in the 1950s, the Miller-Urey experiments, where they figured, well, here would probably be the chemicals that would be on Earth at the time when they put some lightning into a test tube and they got some activity there. But we just don't know. But we're comfortable saying we don't know. We have some theories. We do know, like I said, that when you put atoms and molecules that become stuck together and they become polypeptides and then polypeptides, we start to see some activity. We think that activity over long periods of time, we're talking millions of years, tends to produce something that we would term as life in terms of reproducing and all that.
And most Christians don't dispute that the biochemistry and the bonds all happen through natural law. It's the question I raised today was the information that's behind that, right? So before it came,
Talking to the mic.
Oh, sorry. What I was saying is that the Christians don't contest any of that about origin of life. Is that the chemistry and the physics bonded these chemicals together. The question is, where did that complex information come from? It's a question that Thomas Nagel, an atheist at NYU, one of the smartest philosophers, has said we in principle cannot answer that. It's not about what we don't know yet. It's about what we do know, and out of principle, a naturalist, materialist, neo-Darwinistic mechanism cannot account for the process of information, the arrival of information. It's not only him, there's others like Anthony Flew and others that have decided that.
The next question is directed to Gil. Why do you believe that we must live in a utopian world with no pain or suffering in order to believe that God exists?
It's simply a fact that God has certain attributes, and those attributes of being all powerful, all good, merciful, just, and all that. It's not a utopian thing, is that if you have a God that has these attributes, then the way he should construct his world is one where his creation, including animals, do not gratuitously suffer. And we are in a world where we see that. Just very quickly, there's a famous little story of Christopher Hitchens, who was a big proponent in our camp. He talks about, humans have been around in our present form about 100,000, 150,000 years, and suffer terribly. Childbirth, child death, infant mortality, above 50%, above 80%, oftentimes taking their mothers with them. People's life expectancies in their 20s, dying from injuries, falls. Imagine if you broke your thigh 50,000 years ago, what would you do? Imagine if you broke it 100 years ago, what would you do? And his position is, imagine this deity up there with his arms crossed, watching his creation suffer terribly. No refrigeration, no antibiotics, people dying oftentimes of oral disease. And he sits on this for all these years. And then 2,000 years ago, he says, can't take it anymore. I'm sending somebody down to fix this. And instead of sending down someone to go all over the world to spread he goes to this Iron Age area in the Middle East and shows himself to a few people, and this religion just struggles to get going and all that. That's ridiculous. If God says, you know what, I can't take it anymore, I can't take my people suffering, having the ability to do everything to make his presence known, that is the last thing and the last way he should have approached this. So I don't quite have respect for the method that he used. And then once he's here, then we have this divine hiddenness. Where is he? If he wants everybody to believe in him, show yourself. Make it more apparent. Don't play games with us. That's my answer.
Okay. You brought up Christopher Hitchens. I just wanted to comment on that because he's also said that 99% of all species have been extinct. What kind of God designs that? Daniel Dennett has talked about the suffering and how most organisms die than those that survive. So why is survival a good thing? If everything and the majority of species die, why is survival good?
Same way why I'm going to have lunch in a few minutes and dinner, because I want to stay alive. I'm enjoying life. I think any human being, any animal has the survival instinct. Unfortunately, sometimes nature conspires against us, but I'm not quite sure the nature of the question. We all want to live. We have a survival instinct.
Right, I was just going with we all want to, and I want to as well, but just in the larger objective sense, why is...
Evolution by natural selection.
Yeah.
Okay, looking at the clock, we're going to have to make this the last one. Please explain why states where can't read it completely, evangelism is the primary religion face far worse than other states on social welfare. In other words, I think you understand the ethical aspect of it. Why do evangelical religions not improve man's social status, so to speak?
Also, the question assumes that if you're evangelical, you'll be stupid. Well, there's a lot of evangelicals that are stupid.
Yeah.
I'm here to defend that Christianity is not stupid, and it's worth thinking about. I thought I provided pretty good reasons that weren't answered tonight. So again, I could be wrong. I could be stupid, but I wanted to keep the ideas kind of separate from me because I mess a lot of things up. So I'm looking for kind of answers to the big questions we all have to answer. And I don't know. There's all sorts of socio-demographics that impact that. I'd have to see why it would cause that. If you believe in God and then you're poor, that's a separate matter of whether it's true or not, or if he really exists.
Okay. I think these gentlemen deserve a rousing round of applause.
And just to say, stay tuned because Dan and I, now that we've done the preparatory work, are going to start to get together to deal with specific issues: church-state separation, abortion, homosexuality, gay rights. We want to get as many people on either side of these issues to come into a room like this. Let's have a discussion on specific topics, and let's see if we can compromise, negotiate, or just agree to disagree.
If I could just say one thing, too. Is my mic off? All right, well, I just wanted to thank Gil because it's not easy to debate these kinds of issues with people, and when you get into something that's really deep-seated beliefs, it's really hard to keep a straight face, and sometimes you get worked up, and I really want you to know that I deeply respect this man, and I really do think that you guys are free thinkers for having me here, so thank you so much.